account. So this is a webinar of the Student Innovation Program. And today, I'm giving floor to Professor Pablo Muñoz about how to measure social impact, how to report and capture it. So floor is yours.
Excellent. I need to stop sharing so I can share mine.
Yes, exactly.
All right, brilliant. All right, thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation. And apologies, my Latvian is completely non-existent. I don't even say hello in Latvian, so I'll need a bit of teaching at some point, right? So, okay, my name is Pablo. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at Durham University Business School in the UK, and currently editing the Journal of Business Venturing Insights. And Insights, and I've been doing research in social entrepreneurship, sustainable entrepreneurship, social investment, and linked to that, inevitably, there's a topic of social impact measurement as a way of demonstrating, right, capturing and demonstrating the value that entrepreneurs and generally social interventions create in the world. And what I'm going to be presenting today is the insights from two pieces of work we've done with my colleagues Hayley Beer and Ed Gamble. Hayley, she's at Warwick University, and Ed is at University of Vermont in the US. So that would be kind of pretty much it, right? So insights from those two pieces of work. So let me start with a general reflection on social impact measurement, because there are different aspects to it, and different types of complications and different type of settings, and that's kind of taken differently depending on where you go. So this is an organization I've been involved with for many years. It's called Balloon Latam. It's a Latin American social enterprise delivering entrepreneurship programs in rural areas. It started back in 2011 with a very simple 5-week intervention in rural communities, and essentially it's a 5-week training program, right? So offering support to local entrepreneurs and working every time with around 100 people, right? And obviously, as the model was growing and the time was passing, they realized that there was much more that they can do. So they move into follow-up activities, and then creating communities of practice, local innovation councils, so entrepreneurs can get together, local fairs, a bit more training. Then there's a scaling up, investment funds, right? So it ended up in 2015 with a fairly already intervention model. They started sort of going back, right? So because they realized that there was this assessment to be made, well, to get a sense of what's going on. They work very closely with local authorities and local companies. So, okay, there was a kind of a lot of dialogue involved before even running this 5-week program, right? So they went again from a 5-week program to a 3-year intervention model with a few kind of activities in between. And the founder and CEO, a good friend of mine, he's obsessed with measurement. He get trained with JPAL on RCTs, randomized control trials, and so he went like crazy with social impact measurement. He wanted to show, right, that the work he was doing, it was effective, and there were lives being transformed as a result of the intervention, right? So there was a setback baseline assessment, output line, second outline, 3. So it's down the line, measuring, right? So, and that led us to rounds of reporting to both local Spanish-speaking stakeholders, but also international funders interested in investing in Balloon Latam, right? But very descriptive at the beginning, showing how the reality of entrepreneurs was changing across the communities we were working with, right? So in terms of employment, confidence, funding, media coverage, and as a result of that, there was a lot of learning and in restructuring of the business model, right? So a much more refined set of activities, now plan in a sort of a monthly basis. And obviously the expectations of social value and the complexity of the modeling tools was also sort of evolving, right? So this is the 2018-2020 intervention model. And then more reporting, and the reporting was getting more and more complex. And now building relationship between variables, so just not describing what was going on. And again, just giving ideas, right? So up until something, I was a non-executive director at that point. That was 2018, and Sebastian, the CEO and founder, he decided to run a randomized control trial, right? So if you know something about randomized control trials, you'll know that they're very complex, very expensive, and you don't really get too much information from it. But they went ahead anyways, and they ran the random control trial. And this is sort of a results we got, and showing that effectively Balloon was having a positive impact on the communities we're working with, right? And at that stage, we were talking about like thousands of entrepreneurs being trained, many communities going international, so operating not just in Chile, but also in Argentina and Mexico, considering Colombia, considering Guatemala at that point. So it was a fairly kind of a successful social enterprise. At that stage, it was valuing, I think it was $3.5 million. For Latin American social enterprises, is quite a big thing, right? So getting more and more complex, right? I guess you know what we're going with it, right? So, but what is interesting, right? Sebastian is that guy with the hands up right at the very back. This is the Balloon Latam team. They're all young people, all in the sort of Sebastian, I think, is in early 30s. So he's been running this business for a long time, but since he was like a 20-year-old graduate. What is interesting, right? I have a lot of conversation with him. What is interesting is that I remember when a time we were just driving back to Santiago, and he comes to me and say, well, you know what, I do all of this, meaning social impact measurement, but I know and I do it, social impact measurement, but I really know when I see people smiling. So then the question is, why do you do it then, right? And there's no direct answer to that, right? So they don't really know what they're doing, and it's super complex, super costly, but they know in different ways. So there was this sort of a tension between how companies know, how social enterprises know that they're making an impact on their beneficiaries, right? In how people get to know, right? And that took us to, with that sort of idea in mind, that brought us together, right? So Haley, she's in operation management. She's been exploring performance measurement and management in social enterprises. Ed, he's from accounting, and I'm in entrepreneurship prof. So it was a really interesting group and how we were seeing things, right? And we started looking at the reality of social impact measurement in our own context, right? In the UK and the US, Europe, where you have fairly institutionalized realities, right? So in the UK, we have the Social Value Act, where we're supposed that governments are supposed to take social value into consideration in any tendering process, where social enterprises are normally used to measurement and reporting, and they're being asked to do it. We have regulation, like the community interest companies in the US, the limited liability companies, or even the benefit corporations. So you have legal frameworks in a very complex apparatus that kind of help organizations report their impact, right? And there are a lot of cool things about it. So they can achieve their goals, they can show and attract funding, they can communicate the social identity, because they now say, well, this is what I do, and you can really see, right, that I'm doing it, right? So my mission actually is delivering, measuring as the promises that are delivering actually outcome, right? They use social impact measurement to learn, to strategize, to improve decision making. They gain legitimacy facing investors and other stakeholders, right? Because they can show that they're actually delivering on the promises. It's a very good way of showing that there's value for money, so they can connect social and financial performance as they're using social impact measurement. It's a very good way of engaging with investors as well. If you think about where most of this is coming from, it's coming from impact investment, right? So that's where at least part of the conversation on social impact measurement emerged. because they're investors, right? Interested in knowing whether or where there's value for money in the world of social enterprises or impact-driven enterprises. So therefore, it motivates conversations about financial and non-financial progress, right? That sort of a blended space, blended reporting and blended investment and so on. And it gradually becomes an important part of the governance of social enterprises, right? Because then you're more transparent, you're accountable. So it's becoming a key part of the governance systems of social enterprises. But at the same time, there are a lot of problems. They're not so, there's a few elements that are not so cool. Social problems are very difficult to work with, right? It's really difficult to make sense of them every place you go. We have the experience with Balloon, right? So moving from community to community, even in the same country, you realize that the problems are completely different. They're complex, and they have different inputs, outputs, right? And it's really difficult to make sense of and work with, right? So what do you measure? How do you measure? It's a big mess, right? Investors, although we have these tools coming from impact investment, they really struggle to see where the investment is going to, how they get returns over that investment. There's also a risk of gaming and washing, right? So there's the idea of greenwashing, sim washing, right? So you do and you measure things that you can, what stakeholders are expecting you to do, and in that sense you manipulate the measurement systems, right? And you play the game, right, within measurement systems to be able to report what stakeholders want to hear. It's a fairly new system, which is obviously there are a lot of opportunities in it because there are not so many experts in social impact measurement, right? So I've worked with governments developing social impact measurement system as part of the incubation of social enterprises, right? And we rely on local capacity, so people with deep knowledge of social impact measurement, either from accounting or from entrepreneurship or from investment. And we found ourselves in a situation where we don't have people, right, available. So there's a train of trainers that we had to make in order to have consultants, right, ready to help social enterprises during the incubation process, right? So to be able to develop some sort of capacity to measure social impact. It's sometimes problematic because sometimes it deviates the attention of social entrepreneurs or managers from running the business. That's what happened with Balloon, right? So they get so obsessed with impact measurement that they stop paying attention to things that were relevant to the business and the business stability and so on. So it might, because it's expensive, it takes a lot of energy, right? And a lot of resources go into social impact measurement. So it's a bit risky in that sense, and that's why a lot of social entrepreneurs they try to avoid it, and they say, well, it's someone else's job, right, to measure impact. And there's always the risk of over commercializing a social intervention, right? Because as you're trying to see value for money, which are going to see where the value for money is, you end up commercializing social change. And there's a sort of even moral aspects that need to be taken into account, where is right, is correct to monetize social change. So that's not so cool about social impact measurement, right? So in this sort of institutionalized context where we've been observing social impact measurement, there's a lot of, as you can know, tensions, right? So there's a tension between what we measure, which is normally immediate outputs, versus the social outcome, social change generally, right? So that should be measured in a longer time horizon. But the investment social entrepreneurs get, they're normally assessed against immediate outputs, right? Because you need to show like rapidly that you're delivering something. So it creates a temporal tension that is really difficult to work with. It tends to be focused on positivistic accounts, what you can show through numbers. It seems that that's more legitimate way of showing impact, and therefore it leaves the more qualitative side, if you like, of social impact measurement, and as you capture realities and change outside of the equation, right? So understanding of impact. So that means that that pluralism that's supposed to be part of SEAM and the inclusiveness of SEAM, it tends to be reduced, right? All the tensions around reporting when it's normally tailored to management needs, and that means that it's to do with the organization and not the beneficiaries you're working with, right? And change happens at the level of beneficiaries, not the level of organization. So you end up focusing on the wrong stakeholders, right? And you measure just to help you as an organization, not to help people to improve their circumstances. And when there's funding attached to it, it's mostly to do with the funders' needs, funders' demands, rather than what's being delivered by whom and to whom, right? So it gets very tension, that little space, when you bring social impact measurement into it, right? So in an institutionalized context, it's difficult, right? So there's a fair share of complication, tensions at all levels, right? In terms of governance, in terms of delivery, investment, and so on. So there's a lot of drawbacks. There's a lot of issues, although there are benefits, clearly so, but it's very problematic, right? So imagine this, right? Imagine you're in a context where SEAM is not required. So no one asking you to do it, because they're not formal structure, they're not kind of a regulation, rules forcing you to engage in social impact measurement. It's more difficult because you don't have guidance. It's more costly because you don't have tools available. And you don't really see benefits, right? Because there's accountability, transparency is not a thing. So therefore, you don't really need to do it, and you don't get any benefits from doing so, right? So it's the case of Balloon. No one was asking them to do it, but they decided to do it anyways, right? And if you're an entrepreneur and you're starting your own business, in early days, that's money that you don't have normally. So it's fairly complicated, and you don't have really guidance, and so no one's showing them how to do it, and offering advice, right? So they're not professionals available to help you do that. So to the question, would you do it? The answer normally held no, right? So there's no point in doing it. But what we realized in our research that we found social entrepreneurs that they were voluntarily choosing to engage in social impact measurement, right? And that obviously triggered a lot of questions, right? So how do they do it when they're not required to do so? And how we wonder, well, how do they approach SEAM, right, when they're not required to do so? So there's a how and why questions that are involved that we didn't have an answer for, right? And that triggers our thinking and say, well, we need to do something here to explain what might be going on in this context. If anything, it would give us insight into the origin of social impact measurement when you don't have enforcing mechanisms, right? So no one's telling you how to do it or forcing you to do it. So we went and first defined what is social impact measurement, right? As an act of capturing, describing, and expressing information about changes in the condition of beneficiaries, right? That have been subjected to, right, or we've been offered social intervention. So that's what we do. We capture, describe, and express information about changes that we see in certain groups of people. It essentially tells us about the influence that social organizations, social enterprises have on people and communities, whether they're effective or not, whether they're delivering on their missions or not, right? And that's very important, right? So it also helps us to see whether we're moving in a certain direction as a whole, as an industry. If we assess collectively, right, the status of the social enterprises in a given place, where it gives a way of knowing whether we're getting there. The problem is that the things that we try to improve and measure, they're very difficult to measure, right? So life, education, life improvement, prosperity, these are things that social enterprises and social industry promise, but they're really difficult to assess, right? So we don't really know whether we're getting closer or moving away from this sort of very ambitious goals that we set for ourselves, and the needs and problems that we and social enterprises are trying to solve. So again, that comes with a lot of complications, right? That not knowing whether we're moving, are we getting closer, moving away from those goals. So there's since we're trying to prove and it's supposed that positivistic accounts are more reliable to rely on rationality, there's a lot of aspects, there's relational aspects, right, and emotional aspects that beyond rationality in how change in condition happened and how people perceive those changes in condition. So currently theory and what we have in terms of assessment tools and ways of explaining rely largely on neo-institutional theories and again rationalized understanding of the world. That means that we over-rely on cognition and rules and schemes, and that tends to ignore the reality and the complexity of social problems that are much more, of course, complicated than what we can do in the sort of with this framework where we summarize social realities. And summarize in a way, we shrink social reality to things that we can measure, and then we end up rationalizing organization. We end up rationalizing reality. So to be able to measure them, right? And we remove actors from their own environment, so they're normally fairly uncontextualized ways of seeing and describing changes in social reality, right? So there are two papers here, and I'll take you through them through the kind of the key insights emerging from those two papers. So there's a paper, one that there's still we've been kind of pushing for a few years, and it's still in the review, that looks into argumentation and social impact accounting. Essentially what entrepreneurs do as they engage in dialogues, right, and trying to communicate, they build arguments, right, and we're trying to see how those arguments are being built. And the second one that we published, it just came out like in July. So it was published online. I think it's early 2021. It just came out in AMD. Is to do with emerging approaches, right? So when these guys are not asked to do, how do they do it? So to give you a sense of where this is all coming from, in 2016 we ran the largest study of social entrepreneurship in Chile, funded by the government, where we survey almost 600 people across the country, and then we did interviews with 17 of them. And then from 2016 to 2019, and after we published this report, we engaged in a number of follow-up activities and engagement with the government and more interviews and different types of sort of a data collection effort, because it was a very interesting setting, right? This is part of a paper we published in JMS, also looking into the social industry in Chile, right? And you see how complex it is, right? So if you know something about Chile, perhaps it's the 1973 to 1990 dictatorship, and how things changed during the time, and how that influenced association, cooperatives, and the social industry obviously disappeared, and the social economy also disappeared from the country, right? And when we recovered democracy back in 1990s, right? So it was a massive surge of social enterprises, fairly linked to this sort of a new generation of people who were then went and funded B Corps in Latin America, the social investment funds, and a lot of kind of the things that now we're seeing across Latin America for some reason started in Chile. So there's been a rapid expansion of pro-social organization, but very little guidance on how to do it, right? So we're supposed to have a collective interest company legal framework back in 2017, and nothing happened. And then there was a social crisis and a few other things in the country, and obviously we're still lacking a regulatory framework, right? So it's a very active social industry with very little guidance, right? So it's kind of a bubbling with no control. So that turned us into a very interesting research setting, right? So we did a sort of a deep dive into the Chilean social industry. Again, fast growing in Latin America, but fairly emerging in terms of its institutional structure. So it's a sort of a beautiful setting, because you can see everything that's going on with social enterprises, but in a very raw way because there's no guidance. There were a lot of government programs in place, but still without fairly intuitive, right? And so just taking a few cases and modeling policy around a few cases, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help them. There was a home for the Latin American B Corps. The thesis is the International Festival for Social Innovation. The first national incubator focused on social enterprise, sustainable enterprise, the Green Startup Chile. The impact investment industry was fairly small but growing, but no legal infrastructure and no guidelines for social impact accounting, right? So it was really interesting. So there's a lot of questions in this context linked to the questions we were making ourselves before, right? So why do they do it? Why do they engage when they're trying to do so? How do they do it? What sort of frame of reference they use, right? If they don't have any guidance, how do they come up with their own sort of ideas of what to measure, how to measure, how do they construct, how they perceive, how they apply social impact accounting in very early stages of the process, and not just the early stages of the process of the enterprise itself, but the very early stages of the social industry as a whole, right? What triggers and what catalyzes ventures to formalize social impact accounting and measurement activities, right? So, so if you take social impact accounting and sort of a change in conditions, right, and you track them back to, okay, where this is coming from, you realize that there's very little theory in it, and therefore the explanations we have, they come from normative framework, right? So they all started in public policy debates, then impact investment followed. So most of what we know, so if there's a very good, what is it, like Mass, I think, a very good report on sort of with an inventory of social impact measurement tools. You realize very quickly that most of this is coming from commercial assessment tool, right, not theory. So it's guided by normative frameworks. And Alex Nichols, probably that someone, if you're interested in social, have interest in social entrepreneurship or social impact measurement, is probably someone you already know. He put forward something called the general theory of social impact accounting, right? As a first, I think it was a very good first attempt to explain the nature of social impact accounting, right? And it's essentially he says, well, social impact accounting, he was looking into the sort of a social return over investment tool, is a combination of data that is very uncertain, is really difficult to collect and very difficult to communicate, but is once you do it, when you start doing it, it empowers people, right? So there's a sort of a tool, accounting tools, as they generate information about changes in condition, right? So people, beneficiaries, and those who run interventions, they feel that now they're empowered, right? So that's therefore altering powered relationships, right? So, and obviously that creates a tension between, he was using Habermas, right, framework for communicative action, right, and the tension between facticity and validity, right? So these are things that are very difficult to reconcile, and because normally the way you capture relationships, right, and empowerment is very qualitative in nature, right? So how things work and how you deal with uncertain data is normally by developing positivistic frameworks, right? This is how you express data that's really difficult to express. And he argues that the way of dealing with that is through something that is called a framework communicative action. And communicative action essentially is a reconciliation of this two through dialogue and through argumentation. So we put forward our ideas on how this should be measured, right? And materiality emerges as a result of that dialogue and that sort of engagement. So we say, well, okay, that's fine. But this is based on social return on investment, a tool that already exists, right? Fairly mature, fairly used, well developed. And we wonder, well, what happens before that here and now presented by social impact accounting theory, right? What happens with that human experience, right? That where the social entrepreneurs specifically are navigating the uncertainty of the data and the empowerment that comes with it. and that's obviously, it's clearly a very interesting area of research, and that needs further theorization. That's what sort of I wanted to do. We wanted to theorize that sort of very, very early stages of engagement with social impact measurement, right? And then we thought, well, okay, if the tensions involved, right, in sort of uncertain data and empowerment, right, and we know that there are tensions from other pieces of work, and you can imagine, right, so positivism and subjectivism and all of that sort of in play, it triggers a lot of tension. So we say, well, if communicate action are about finding consensus, right, and trying to balance the values of social life, and link that to how you represent those values of social life. So, well, if that's done through negotiation, deliberation, argumentation, well, perhaps that's where the key is, right? The key is in resolving how those arguments are being constructed, right? So it's the argumentation process that people put forward, and that's essentially the core of communication, right? This is how you communicate your ideas about impact. So that's what we decided to do, look into the arguments, and because of that central in as people engage in consensus building and trying to figure out, okay, what's the best way of measuring and generating accounts about changes in condition, right? So that's a question we were trying to answer at that stage, right? So how do social entrepreneurs construct arguments to communicate social impact? So we went back to that data we had. So we analyzed those 70 interviews, and we then engaged in a from 2016 to 2019, before COVID, several follow-up activities, roundtable discussions, where we kind of presented in the early stages of this research project, and we got feedback. And anyways, we did a lot of things with social entrepreneurs in the country, and then we started sort of exploring using argumentation theory, exploring the emergent argumentation, right? We try different theoretical framework. We used Goffman's frame theory first. It didn't really work well, so we ended up working with argumentation theory. And obviously, the unit of analysis of an argumentation is the construction of arguments, so it's the argument itself. And the arguments are essentially about claims and support, right? So how people make claims, how you construct a claim, and how you support that claim, right? And there are many ways of doing it. So what we found is a very interesting bifurcation in the construction of arguments, right? Where in situations where people are trying to communicate impact, aspirations, and what they're achieving, right? So first, we realized that there's arguments for reporting. They're normally sort of outward-looking argumentation, and those arguments are constructed through objectification and compression of changes, right, in social problems and in the actors involved and the actions, right, that mobilize action. And essentially they do that because they want to be held accountable to others, right? So it's a way of building legitimacy into the business. And there was a different way of doing it, what we call the argument for worth. And it's very close to meaning and purpose that is involved in social enterprises, and that's constructed through unfoldment. So you make it your own, and projections, right? To think about the future and how your meaning has an impact on the future. And that's to do with, again, that the changes in social problem, actors, and action. And through that, they want to be held accountable to themselves. So they look, it's a very inward looking process and a way of constructing arguments, and they say, well, am I being true to my own purpose, right? And it's very interesting how they talk to each other, arguments for reporting and arguments for worth, and also how they clash with each other. So there's this bifurcation, right, in that is leading to different ways of constructing arguments, that into construsting factual claims and values claims, right? So when you construct arguments for worth, they're normally driven by value judgments to do with meaning and purpose in life. Whereas when you construct arguments for reporting, you tend to factual claims, right? You're trying to support it using factual evidence, right? No value judgments. So this is where we are now with our theoretical model, which is not yet a model, just a more refined view of those sort of early argumentation of social impact measurement. And these are marked by for which we now see as tensions, right, between the way arguments are constructed and the way claims are constructed and supported. So we have this sort of a dual construction of arguments for communicating impact, and that again is divided into different ways of doing it. So, for example, in accountability to others, which is arguments, construction of arguments for reporting through objectification and compression, claims they're constructed through distant interactions. You remain away, very, very distant from that social reality. It's you just show a gradual transformation. Because it's mostly focused on outputs, no outcomes, right? You just can capture whatever is happening in the moment. So that's how you construct claims. And those claims are constructed, so are supported by fact that you obtain by just capturing chunks of reality, right? So the only representation of reality, so capturing changes in the educational system by looking into how many courses are delivered, right? Or how many books are distributed in a classroom, right? So there's a big difference between changing the system and delivering a training program. And again, these are supported by present outputs, the book, the training, and so on. Whereas as arguments for worth are driven by mostly value judgments and through unfolding and protecting, so making your own and thinking about the future. You construct those claims through close interactions by seeing people smiling, right? And as I was just mentioning before, you dream about radical transformation. It's not just gradual transformation. You think about kind of, again, dramatic changes in the educational system, dramatic changes in the health system, right? So where everyone have access to health and education and so on. So it's a very bold way of constructing claims about impact. And they're supported by value judgments about complex social realities and mostly focused on future outcomes. So you see that there's big clash, right? The way arguments are constructed, claims are constructed, and claims are supported. They're in opposition, right? And what's interesting here and what we notice is that when they try to bring it together in very early stages, they feel frustrated because it's really difficult to combine, right? Outcomes and outputs, right? So how do they make sense of changes in the present and changes in the future? So there's a bit of frustration. They feel very, very uncomfortable when they're trying to build this sort of different types of argumentation together. So that's where we are with it, and I think we're contributing to literature in important ways, right? So we're providing an illustration of the beginning of social impact accounting with this one. We are showing what might underlie the construction of arguments as you're constructing sort of a framework to communicate impact. And that gives you a way into what might be happening before a communicative action framework is finally developed. And we show that social impact measurement, despite what we think, is not just about measurement, right? Perhaps measurement is actually less relevant to in comparison to how people build arguments, right, to communicate impact, right? And then we're showing sort of the very early stages of the construction of arguments to be able to communicate impact, right? So what we did next in our research, we thought, well, right, this is fairly interesting. Funny enough, the paper we this is the paper that was the fair paper the piece of research we did with the data we had, and this is the one we did next, but this one came out first. So this is the paper that we just published in AMD. It's a reflection, sort of it's a follow-up from the one that we haven't yet published. So what we did next, we spent our attention on the tool itself. The tool is being constructed by these social entrepreneurs, and start reflecting on the formalization of those tools, because they were already considering, say, for example, B Corp certification, or running a few surveys, or trying to capture small pieces of evidence, or running randomized control trials. So there were different levels of formalization of tools. And that's what we wanted to see, right? So how do people formalize impact when they're not required to do so, and considering the range of possible levels of formalization, right? So in this case, we went to the other data we had. So we went back to that survey data we collected, but instead of, we focused on 152 of them out of the almost 600, because we wanted to take those in between 1 year, I think it was like 18 months of existence up until I think 7 years. So it's not the very nascent stages of social entrepreneurship, because at that stage it's very unlikely that they'll be thinking about social impact measurement. So we consider the ones where already engaged somehow in a social impact measurement, considering formalization or having formalized some sort of a tool. So we take 152 and we run, as Fassi said, qualitative comparative analysis. So that considers two types of analysis. So it's a necessity analysis, seeing what conditions are necessary for the formalization of social impact measurements, and then sufficiency analysis is what combination of conditions might eventually lead social entrepreneurs to formalize impact. And then we engage in another round of the collection. We interview another 12 from this 152 to try to make a sense of the typology, the different types emerging from this analysis, right? What we didn't have at that stage is a model, right? So we didn't have a collection of conditions. So the first thing we did, if you read the paper, I think it's very useful in that sense, because it gives you a way of mapping antecedents and outcomes in social impact measurement. So it was a big review of literature, and we came up with that model, right? So covering the external pressures that's influencing the formalization of impact measurements, all the pressures you get from the environment, from government, investors, market, and civil society, essentially. And then what is internal, right? So all the learning processes and how you use impact measurement, either for strategic reasons, operational reasons, or because you see value in the future, right? I suppose that the more mature you are as businesses are growing and learning, there's an effect of business maturity, right, involved in it, right? Because at some point you will develop it as a way of the natural improvement of the business. And in between the two is certification, is developed internally but granted externally, right? So that also we assumed that firms that going for certification will need inevitably the formalization of, they need to formalize impact measurement. So that's what's the thinking behind it. So that's the model we developed, and they went and test that. The first thing we did, we tested the necessary conditions, right, to retain those that were mostly necessary for the formalization of impact measurement. And interestingly, we found a lot of fairly counterintuitive patterns in our assessment. So when we run the necessity analysis, we realized that the factors we were absolutely sure that they were playing a role, they weren't. So certification is not a necessary condition for the formalization of social impact measurement. Maturity of the business, so that the more mature you are, is not related to the formalization of social impact measurement. And investors' pressure, right? So we measure rounds of investment under the assumption that the more rounds of investment, the more engagement you have with investors. Therefore, there will be more pressure to assess in a very formal way the impact of the organization to be able to show the investors there's value for money. But interestingly, it's not a necessary condition for the formalization of impact measurement. That was the first surprise, right? The big aha, because we're really, certain that those three were the ones we were going to retain, and then we realized that those are the ones we had to drop if you want to understand the formalization of social impact measurement, at least in non-institutionalized context. And then we found a few that were almost necessary, but not as really relevant as the other ones, right? So the strategic value of the same, that you normally use it for legitimacy purposes, right? Because it's a way of legitimizing the social mission. It actually wasn't that relevant. It's actually peripheral to the formalization of social impact measurement. And then we found 4 novel approaches to same, right? That we turn into an empirical typology, right? That's the FSQCA that you can see in the paper with detail. And from it, we have 4 SIM approaches. So that means that there's 4 different ways of formalizing social impact measurement in non-institutionalized context, right? So here's a summary, and we play a bit with the findings from the QCA and with the interviews to offer somewhere halfway through, somewhere in between an empirical typology and a normative framework, right, to inform decision making. So there's a forward-looking, outcome-driven, where SIM is a mechanism for understanding and communicating how improvement in the practice organization contribute to the future success of the business, right? And that leads to a different type of way of doing it, where the companies need to pay attention to, their orientation, and how much you report, right? And again, this is coming from the data, and it's interesting how it's distributed, right, across the many things that organizations do and pay attention to. So in that case, they have to mostly focus on business performance and how that performance enables future success of the business. In that sense, it's very, very likely that social impact measurement will be fairly narrow. They will be focusing on a few aspects of the organization. There's no really much formalization needed there, because it's mostly focused on internal audiences, right? So it's up to the organization to make sense of their own impact and communicate that internally. Then there's the inward-looking, process-driven, which is mostly about learning and improving processes and practices relating to impact. That means that you will be focusing on different things, internal processes and organizational learning and improving practices. It will be equally narrow and informal because it's focused on internal audiences as well. And then we have 2 outward-looking types of social impact measurements. One is driven by market forces, another one is driven by public forces. And the first one, you're facing certain market demands. These are normally social enterprises that they're very active in markets. They rely on consumption rather than contracts, government contracts. So therefore, they change and they communicate what they do and the impacts they make in the world, facing the demands they're getting from consumers, and therefore they focus on mostly market demands and aligning the impacts they want to have with the market, what the markets are expecting, right? Obviously, reporting scope is broad. It tends to be slightly more formal, but since it's primarily market actors, they don't really need to show, because you're not tied to a contract, right? And that comes normally with measurement standards, right? So it's slightly more formal than the other ones because you're attending external audiences, but it's not so much as the following one, right? Which is focused on impacts facing regulatory requirements. It's attached to, most of the cases, to government contracts. What we're trying to do is align the mission of the business with that regulatory requirements, right? It tends to be much more extensive, intensive, not so much broad, right? But extensive in the sense that covers the area that you should supposed to measure as that are linked to that sort of a contract or that piece of regulation that is forcing you to act in a given, or deliver something in a given way, right? Because it tends to be much more formal and focus on external audiences and primarily the regulator, the government, or whatever public institution you have a contract with, right? So 4 different ways in which impact can be formalized, right? And I think there's an important message here, because when their social enterprises are thinking about impact, they're thinking about all the different audiences, all the different stakeholders, and all the ways in which the reasons why you have to do it. You have to do it for a strategic reason. You have to do it to learn. You have to do it to engage with the government, to build legitimacy facing markets, investors, and so on. And what we're seeing here is that there are many different ways in which this can happen, right? And you don't need to have everything at the same time, right? It's very flexible and actually can emerge as a learning process, overall learning process, depending on where you are, who your customer is, who your primary stakeholder is, and what you want it for, right? So it can emerge in many, many different ways. So here, what we're doing, I think we're offering a good understanding, right, of SIM beyond the mission and the mission drift that sometimes we see in the literature, or the immediate outputs where the companies measure to report and to prove that there's value in their actions. I think we offer it's not that we come and resolve the entire theoretical puzzle, right? But we build a theoretical puzzle, right, by modeling from the literature. But we were able to provide clarity in a situation that is fairly complex. So we took that into account and offer a complexity-based explanation, right? Because there's a typology involved in the development of our explanation, right? That explains the just spontaneous emergence of social impact measurement. And what we're able to show a very diverse and counterintuitive reality, right? We were expecting to find something and we found completely the opposite. And that was fascinating, surprising. And clearly gives you more because we're not using one theoretical lens, but a theoretical salad, if you like, right, with many different things involved, and it's really difficult to make sense of how they work together. And QCA gives you a way to resolve that, right? And it gives you an insight if you're in a non-institutionalized context, as most contexts, right? Currently, it gives you insight into how to measure, collect, analyze, and report evidence on social impact measurement. So that's what we did, and I think we still have. Stop sharing my slides to be able to see people, if people are still there.
Yes, we're still here.
Yeah.
Good. Maybe don't take off your slides.
Okay.
I don't know whether anyone else has questions, because I do have questions. If
Sure.
No one else, I do have questions. Yeah, thank you very much, Pablo. It was really interesting regarding social impact and regarding social enterprises. I have myself worked several years in NGO, youth organization, which they also call themselves social enterprise. And so they sometimes also were thinking how to promote them, how to yes, advertise their social impact. So, and this was very interesting to see that it's a separate topic. So I remember that they were like kind of usually they were using numbers. So for example, oh, we have reached that kind of amount of people, young people, we have educated so many people. So usually it was like, numerical data. Yeah, which is very interesting. Yeah. In one of the slides, you mentioned about certification, which was in your model that you developed. Can you a bit elaborate on that, about the certification? You mean that it could be a new certification, or like something like related to already?
What we did with that model, we were trying to figure out from the literature what are the possible antecedents of social impact measurement formalization. So what drives social enterprises to formalize? And what we found is that normally social enterprises do it because they engage in certification processes, right? Mm-hmm. It seems fairly intuitive, right? Because you say, well, to be able to certify, you need to prove. To prove, you need to measure. And that's a driver of formalization, right? So the more, because we measure range levels of formalization, right? So going from fairly informal and ad hoc tools. So run, say, I don't know, small, remember companies having their own feedback on Facebook. They were counting that as a way of measuring impact, right? And that's fair enough. That's a representation of it, but that's fairly informal. It's not structured, and is not relevant to social impact measurements. It's not designed to capture impact, but they're doing it nonetheless, right? But that's a one level of formalization, all the way up to randomized control trials that they're supposed to measure impact in a very rigorous way, right? Mm-hmm. You have a range of things that companies can do. So the assumption here from the literature was that the certification and the more certifications you have, the higher the level of formalization of that tool. So you develop more sophisticated tool to measure impact, right? And what we found is actually the opposite. It's not that the opposite, right? But we found that actually certification is not a driver. It's not a necessary condition for certifications. Not that because you have certifications, you will engage in more formalized ways of measuring impact, right? There's no relationship between the two. So that was very interesting. And the certifications, again, it can range from I don't know, things that they're not they're structured but not relevant to impact, to social impact. So I don't know, an ISO 9000 is quality control, right? It gives you structure, it gives you continuous ways of continuously improving the organization, but it's not really related to impact. So it's very rigorous but not relevant to impact. And there are tools that they're relevant to impact, certification tools relevant to impact, but they're not particularly rigorous in terms of how they're audited, right? So Beaker's somewhere there because it's relevant to impact, but it's not audited as you would have, for example, an auditing process with ISO, right? GRI, for example, GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, is both relevant to social impact and in the auditing process is very demanding, right? So that would be a very demanding and relevant certification in relation to impact. So we were capturing that, right? So different degrees of certification against different degrees of formalization. And that's where we didn't find really a relationship between the two, right? So it doesn't really matter. Certification doesn't really matter for formalization.
Okay, cool. Yeah, this is what I wanted to clarify. And the second question, which I had, I was thinking on one of the slides who was, or maybe no, have you were thinking about developing some practical tools, like, I don't know, like a toolkit for the social enterprise? Okay, these are the ways how to measure or capture the social impact. So
with that one, I think is revision 2 of this paper, the one that's in academic discoveries. And version 2, I think we had a very practice-oriented framework. And then obviously, as you would expect in journals, we were asked to, because there's, I mean, as any normative framework, there's a lot of speculation, right? In it, you play with concepts and you try and push the normative thinking and prescription. So we were asked to like dial back and cut a few things from it. And we ended up with a summary, again, a very adventurous summary with some normative tones, right? When you talk about attention, orientation, and reporting scope, you say, okay, you're given somehow recommendation on what to pay attention to, depending on where you want to start with your formalization process. So this this table, in spirit, it contains a normative framework, right? Because to say, well, you can start by thinking about the future, right, and driven by outcomes, right? That means that if you want to conceptualize social impact measurement internally as a social enterprise, you say, okay, just go and focus on future success and try and see how improvements in impact can contribute to the success of the venture. If you're going to do that, you need to pay attention to business performance, and the performance today linked to the future success of the business. So perhaps you need to pay attention to the links between social and financial performance, not just social performance, right? And then don't waste time, just focus on what you need to focus on, right? Very narrow, and keep it informal because you're using it for internal learning, right? Nothing else. If you want to start with, say, if you got a contract with the government, you're going to have to change your approach, right? Because that's a government contract regulating what you're supposed to do and what you're supposed to deliver. So perhaps forget about the other one, right? So you can keep adding up, right? And just integrate everything if you want to pay attention to learning, to strategy, to markets, and to governments. But you need to be aware that the more you do, the more costly it gets, right? And complicated it gets. So this is still in the paper. They managed to survive the review process. It offers some guidance, but clearly can be turned into a practical tool for sure. And it's fairly supposed to be fairly easy to do, because it's already in normative tone. We haven't done it. I guess it's just not having enough time to do it. But yeah, it's open. If you or any of you guys want to take it forward and develop tools, it's pretty much ready to go. We feel.
Yeah, because this is very crucial also for new also enterprises, for example, when they're starting just the business. Okay, what was the impact that we want to do, and what kind of impact can you do practically? Yeah, so yeah.
What's important here is because when I do a lot of kind of a teaching and executive education and with my MBA students and so on, and say, okay, what do I do? Why do I use, right? And normally the signposting goes to the tools themselves, right? Or go to the Iris catalog and pick from the Iris catalog, which is a collection of impact measurement tools. Go to the outcome stars, right? The outcome star model that allows you to sort of assess and then describe the impact. Go to I don't know, theory of change, right? And use that tool. But what you don't find in the selection of tools is the rationale for doing it, right? So, okay, why that tool? Is that really the tool I need to use for what I'm trying to do? So the normative framework we have here, which is again is a reflection of early stages when in social industry with no set of institutionalized rules, it gives you the why behind it, and that probably gives you a way to better select the tools you need. But say if you go for a forward-looking outcome-driven approach and it's informal, you don't need an outcome star for that, right? So don't overcomplicate things if you don't need to overcomplicate things, right? So you can keep it easy, keep it informal, develop more gradually, much more organically, right? And then don't push yourself to, because if you use the outcome star, an outcome star mandates, right, a certain dimensions that you have to assess and assess in a certain way and report in a certain way, that means that you're going to have to invest time and resources in doing that, right? If you don't need it, why would you invest those amount of resources into it, right? It doesn't make any sense. So that's why I think this paper is valuable, because it gives you that sort of a thinking behind the tool I'm going to use to report impact, right? Rather than just jumping straight into the tool itself.
Yeah, that's very useful. Yeah, indeed, and very so worthy. Okay, cool. Any other has any questions? Anyone?
Yeah.
If not, yes.
I do have a question. Yeah, so thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting, and I would even say a bit of challenging, because between the lines I read the ambition to achieve the model that really can measure the impact. What we have been struggling, we have been developing also some methodologies for our Ministry of Welfare, how to measure social impact. And we were struggling with those qualitative soft aspects of the impact that you really can't measure. You can, at best, you can only assess the improved well-being and so on and so forth. Well, what's your plan? Do you really have the ambition to develop the models that will quantify those qualitative aspects, or yeah?
So, I think we need to think about impact measurement in a broader sense, right? And trying to capture that pluralistic understanding of social impact measurement, because what we're trying to do here is get a sense of changes in condition of people in their own context, and we're trying to communicate how those changes have been produced, right? Positivistic accounts help, but that reduces reality, right, into representation, chunks of reality, right? So measuring, for example, learning and improvement in lives through learning by counting how many books, right, children have read. perhaps a good proxy. It doesn't give you an understanding of that individual's reality, right? And there are no better ways of doing it, right? That's unfortunately, right? So you can just track the life of hundreds of individuals, but there's a point where it's not cost effective, right? So you need to just stay with those proxies that gives you a good understanding of what might be going on. Now, how you cover the rest, you use a different range of tools, right? And that's the more pluralistic understanding of social impact measurement, right? And you go with a portfolio approach, right? So there's something I didn't include here, that you have a range of tools at your disposal. And it's not a tension, right? There's no trade-off between qualitative and quantitative, right? Or positivistic and subjective approaches to it. My advice is always kind of take that pluralism, right? That gives you social impact measurements, and you can combine perfectly so proxies. They're not perfect, but it gives you a way into that reality, right? To get a broader sense of what's going on. And then you go and you can tell stories. You can use images, right? You can use storytelling, right? So there are many tools, narratives, painting, right? Objects, right? So what people achieve as a result of the intervention, that by themselves, they don't give you the full picture either, right? If you show one story, well, your reaction is, well, yeah, but that's one story, right? I'm here, we're talking about 1,000 people. Tell me more. If you go just with the book, right, you will end up with the same. Well, fair enough, but you're not telling me how things are changing. So you have to combine the two, right? And consider that what you're trying to express here is changes in condition, and you need that sort of a pluralistic account to be able to do it properly. So always the invitation is portfolio approach, right? Whatever gives you the broad representation, and then whatever tells the story of change.
Well, yeah, proxies is one of the options that you can use, and of course the question is how good and feasible they are, but that's a different question. Another question that we have been struggling with in terms of measuring the impact: should we distinguish short-term and long-term impact?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the output outcome tension, right? The output is fairly easy to measure as things are happening tomorrow. So how many courses you've delivered, and again, if you're in health, right? So if you reduce the waiting times and so on, it doesn't really tell you whether you're changing a system, right? Where you're benefiting people in the long run, which is very difficult to measure. So there's a mapping that you can do, right? And to show, because again, measuring long-term impact is very difficult. You're gonna have to wait 20 years to be able to show, and you don't have that time, right? So you need investment and funding tomorrow. Well, so yeah, what you can do it and sort of show through, you can do conceptual mapping, right? So the theory is changing the way it gives you that, right? You start from that sort of ultimate goal, but you can do it in the opposite way. Say, okay, here's my certain outputs, right? And I'm seeing from what we know, from other cases, from the literature, you're seeing that if we deliver this, right, there will be an impact here, there will be an impact here, right? And the conditions remain relatively stable, right? There's a system that will improve, right? Necessarily, that will learn and interact. Is challenging, right? Because we live in complex systems, right? So there's something I always love to change in my students. I think I have it in here, in my investment set of there's measurements, investment slide, which is that that's the obesity map, right? That's the complexity obesity map. Let me just let's keep and show it to you, right? So we live, I mean, those who work in social problems, right, and trying to solve social problems, measure social problems, right? We feel that we can establish causal attribution, right? So we intervene, and the outcome of that intervention can be attributed back to the intervention itself, right? And that's the impact measurement assumption, that we can actually say, well, that's the result of my intervention. But say if you're if you're social enterprises delivering interventions in to improve obesity, right, reduce obesity, right, you will be working in one space, right, of this diagram. And you feel that whatever changes in the obesity map will be the result of your action, but it's not, because the system is changing all the time. So the message from when we work with system theory is that you can never attribute the outcome of intervention to the intervention itself. So that reduces the weight, right, on the social enterprises, from the social enterprises' shoulders, right? Because you can say, well, yeah, I'm achieving certain outputs, right? And from what we know how systems evolve and the situation remain relatively stable, some things should happen as a result of it. But it's impossible, given what we know from systems, that you can actually attribute something that will happen 20 years down the line to the actions you're doing today, right? With certainty, right? With measurement tools. You can say, well, we're working in that direction. And because from what we know how systems work, but it doesn't mean that we will be able to achieve that as a result of our actions, right? So we're doing the best we can. So there are a bunch of new approaches now in the social impact measurement side. One is human learning systems, and replacing the hard accountability by learning processes instead, right? So changing a bit of the logic of accountability, and rationalize accountability, and do something different instead. But they're in very early stages, right? So the different ways of thinking about this. So it's challenging, very, very challenging. I think it's important to keep in mind, but also to keep in mind that we live in complex systems, and making that claim that you're actually making an impact, right, and an outcome in 10 years down the line, 5 years down the line is very difficult to sustain.
Oh yeah, it really is. But politicians always want to have it on the agenda, and they want to.
Of course.
How to estimate the impact 5 years from now.
Oh yeah, promise it. They don't. I mean, they're not going to measure it anyway. So there's another side to it that we've done a lot of work in social impact bonds space, right? And there's the workarounds, right? The social enterprises do. The social impact bonds essentially is a government contract, right? And very, very heavy on impact measurement as a system. And what social enterprises do, they promise, and then they don't care. These are social enterprises that have been delivering public services for many, many years, and say, okay, they'll come and ask, right? We're going to tell them what they want to hear, and then we just carry on doing the work because we know how to do it, right? So there's a bit of that as well, that where social enterprises ultimately they have to deal with situations that they know are impossible situations, right? The government asking them about 5 years down the line, just go and promise.
Okay. and I will put in the reference to you.
Of course, yeah. Just go, promise.
No,
that's what all organizations do. That's what all organizations do, right? So they promise. Obviously, there's a element of responsibility, right? So from what we know, from evidence, from all the cases, we know if we work in this direction with this group, something might happen. It's very likely, but we cannot be certain, right? That's the thing, and that's this new human learning approach. What it gives you is that sort of space of trust. We say, well, these guys have been doing it for 20 years, right? And everything tells us that if they keep doing this, outcomes will emerge at some point down the line. I'm just trying to kind of trust that people will do their best and trying to achieve that result they want to achieve.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
you're welcome.
Okay, thank you so much. I think this was very insightful and very also relevant to our student innovation program, because we have lots of courses and activities regarding sustainability and also like social impact. So I think this is very insightful and worthy. Thank you so much again. And yes, the webinar was part of the SE, the Student Innovation Program, empowered by Stockholm School of Economics in Riga and co-financed by European Regional Fund. So we'll be happy to see you also in other activities. And this video will be posted on Facebook for everyone else again to watch it and view it and learn more. Okay, thank you so much, Pablo. Also, thank you. Thank you, everyone else, and have a nice evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.